Awesome. Well, thanks for joining. I'm Jen with Career Services. We've got like most people online, a couple people in the room. So excited to chat a little bit this morning about the academic job search. It's a little spicy this time of year with, federal announcements and things like that. But basically the goal of this session is just to dispel, I don't know, some of the myths or confusion around what the academic job search looks like, what are the possible opportunities people are typically going for. And then our goal at Career Services is just to kind of pitch how we can walk alongside each of you. We have a once a Vandal, always a Vandal policy with Career Services for all U of I faculty, staff, alum, students. So happy to help with any process of this, whether it's the search or your documents, etc. So just a yeah, I guess set the tone. If this sounds familiar, you are not alone. I know Reddit is a common space that, people might be venting their feelings. And I know there's kind of this narrative behind the academic job search of, gosh, I've been applying year after year. I'm not getting anything. I've secured all this funding. I have all these articles and citations. Another example is, Dear Search Committee. WTF, I've checked all the boxes, what justification could you possibly have? Or I pulled this up last night, an adjunct instructor position, under 24 hours posted and already has over 100 people applying for it. So I don't mean for this to be scary, but I know it's like the conversations we all are having kind of around coffee or drinks is like, gosh, this job market is its own beast that you have to fight on top of all of your responsibilities as a grad student. So our goal today, of course, I'm going to give a quick plug on Career Services if you're just not familiar with what our office does. Define like a little bit of just like what the different roles in academia are if you're not super familiar with those. And then also just have some kind of practical advice on searching for positions, kind of what that process typically looks like. I say typical because it is not a set formula, like most job searches. So we have the motto in Career Services, your future is our mission. And that serves, again, current students, prospective, alumni, faculty, staff. The key thing here is, we sometimes in Career Services get this reputation of like, get a real job, like put on your suit, go take something, do something practical with your life. We have the motto that you define career success, whether that's needing remote work to support your family or lifestyle, whether that's working in a certain industry. So our goal is just to kind of walk alongside all of our vandals and provide resources and support along the way. If you were to schedule an appointment, these are kind of literally the buttons that you could click on in Handshake to schedule. But just to kind of remind folks, we do more than just resumes and CVs. We love working on those documents. Haven't gotten tired of them yet, but we also will obviously or can chat about any career related thing like salary negotiation, the job search in general. Networking can be a really popular topic, particularly for grads or post grads. And then just a lot of these resources, like our Career Services website is a hub of where you can schedule an appointment. Lots of career data resources can be found there, upcoming events, job postings, all that fun stuff. And then we are a Handshake school. Handshake is one of many job boards you could use, but it can be a good hub since it is particularly geared towards university students. So, and there is quite a bit of internships or fellowships that are more geared towards the graduate level of experience. So I missed including a couple slides, but just as a shameless plug, today, if you happen to be on campus, there's an event called Joe's Closet happening from all day basically, and then from 10 to 1. There's photos, there's a free professional closet, so if you need to spiff up some professional dress, there's actually quite a lot of clothing and it's mostly pretty good. There's a few items that I'm like, I don't know, this is maybe a little too much skin that I would have on professional dress, but can take what you want. And then the other shameless plug is just that the career fair coming up is on February 12th. That's a Wednesday from 1:30 to 5:30 in the Kibbie Dome. So, as you know, there's a variety of roles specifically working in academia. And the first kind of category of those are going to be your academic roles, aka the faculty. So I'll kind of talk through all of these really briefly individually, but just want to give some definitions if you aren't familiar and kind of what the distinctions are between these different types of faculty types of roles. Okay. So many of you probably are a teaching assistant or have been, but two of the most common roles in academia for a graduate student would be a TA or an RA, where you're funded and also have a stipend, which I know is not always a lot, but something. And then you're working either with students in a class setting or working on a research setting. A next level that many doctoral students will go to post-graduation would be what they call a postdoc, which is essentially like a contract or temporary position where you will continue either your own research or you will join a research project that is ongoing at an institution. These are candidly usually not people's longer term career goals. It's sometimes a bit of a gap year where they can continue to work on getting published, work on their university service. And they're typically at universities, though they can be sometimes in industry as well. You will often see people do postdocs for often 1 to 3 years. That's not like a set rule, but that's usually about the timeline you see people in those types of positions. Okay. So adjunct instructors are going to be part-time as opposed to permanent positions. You will often be contracted to either teach a single class or a couple of classes. And this is something you can do online or for, in person. You can do multiple universities at one time. But basically it's a contract gig where you have a set, fee that they're paying you to deliver on a course over the quarter or semester that university is teaching. Instructors is more of a full-time, you are hired for a full semester at a full-time, typically a full-time rate. Sometimes part-time, but full-time is a little bit more common. And those positions, not always, but typically are more commonly associated with a benefits package for the year. And then you also may have just additional requirements, some admin that you might do. You often might serve on committees, but unlike the rest of the tracks we'll talk about, you don't have to be involved in research. This is not a tenure track type of position. It is a little bit more common that you might see people with more of a master's level doing this long term. Individuals with PhDs usually are looking for different types of positions, typically. So a visiting scholar instructor is also, it's pretty similar. It's a temporary appointment, and usually the goal of the university is just to diversify the faculty that they have teaching or instructors. So as I'll note at the end of this presentation, these are actually just very commonly hired at a different season. So once you've kind of gone through your main season of looking for positions, this is often your opportunity to look for well, if this didn't work out, maybe I could find a visiting scholar or instructor type role. This is often also where you can really capitalize on specific areas of expertise that would benefit the university that you are interested in. So, and then the rest of the roles are kind of the traditional path to being a professor, where people will start out at the lowest level, if you will, of being an assistant professor, which requires a PhD, bunch of research and teaching experience. And this is like the first step of tenure. Typically, these positions will include a mix of research and teaching, usually an advising caseload sometimes, or university service. But that is not guaranteed. I just worked with someone recently who is considering an offer that is only teaching, and it is tenure track, but it's only teaching. So they're kind of weighing if that is the right fit for them, given that they do want to continue publishing. They wouldn't have time built into their schedule for that. So the next step along the path is being promoted to an associate professor, kind of the middle of the road. So you're just going to be, it could be 3 years, it could be 5 years. There's no like exact timeline. A lot depends on the university that you're applying to. And then professor would be that highest level of this path. So the really quick and dirty version of tenure, I know most of you are quite familiar, but tenure is this idea of lifetime employment with a college or university where you're protected from being fired without cause. I know this is actually up in the air in some states that are like reevaluating if they want to keep this process. But the whole point is academic freedom, where you can continue to research ideas or topics that are important without risk of those ideas getting you fired. So it's very competitive. I think you all know there's quite a reputation behind this process of, parish or publish or perish, or just the volume of work, working very, very high numbers of hours. Non-tenured faculty routes, basically the only difference is that you're working on a contract basis. So it might be a 1 year by year is very common, where every year you're being renewed. Or sometimes it's every couple years, and then you don't have that quote unquote publish or perish requirement. But with that, because you don't have a piece of your job dedicated to research, that those hours are going to be allocated with student facing time. So typically your teaching load will be a lot higher, or you'll get extra duties like recruitment or managing student ambassadors or things like that added to your load. So pros and cons for non-tenure track, again, you don't have that pressure of constantly having your research published. Generally, these are folks that are very focused on teaching and getting better at working with students. And your reviews do really matter because, again, you're being renewed on an annual or some sort of a cycle. So the cons would be, of course, you don't have the guarantee of employment forever, which is a great thing. And typically these positions do make a little bit less at most institutions. And as that second bullet point notes, if a university were going through, or a department were going through budget cuts, because of the lack of guaranteed employment, these are the positions that are more likely to get cut. So tenure track, of course, the guarantee of lifetime employment is great. Your academic freedom is protected. But the cons are just that the whole process of getting there. As again, most of you have heard from your faculty, the trial by fire that is. We like to also just point out, again, within academia itself, there are the academic roles, but there are also staff roles. And there's a lot of different departments that you might potentially find yourself in. Advising, student services, program coordinators is a really generic phrase for a lot of different jobs. That could be things like a writing center, that could be a really specific outreach or extension program, My World Careers, disability tutoring. So if you haven't spent time on higher ed jobs, I'm guessing many of you have only clicked on the faculty category and seen all of the jobs there. But I just would encourage, at some point for your leisure, click on the administrative category. And these are all of the categories they have within administrative positions, which I just think gives a really good overview of all the different facets of universities. And then also just wanted to point out, there's, for lack of a better phrase, sometimes a class system of faculty and staff, but many staff roles, particularly at the director, associate director, or director levels, they often do have a preferred qualification for a doctorate level of education. So it is a world where if you want to make sure you're leveraging the level of education you have, these staff roles can be a great fit. Many of these roles also sometimes can have a teaching component negotiated into them, where you might be teaching some classes on the side or developing curriculum. So just to open up the possibilities of, there may be some roles on the staff side that could be a good fit for your background.
I was gonna say that I did that. I'm a director, but I negotiated teaching into my contract.
Nice.
Right? And it's like that's a way to do it. So I emphasize that.
And I'm just gonna steal some coffee.
Yeah.
Okay. I just like to not talk too fluffy about this. It's just that academia it's always been a competitive job market, and I think definitely over the last few weeks, to be candid, that will only increase. But just as the graph, if you haven't seen this, is pretty widely, shown through higher education circles. But this would be, the visual of what they call the enrollment cliff. And this is just the number of high school graduates that will be at that stage of life to enter higher education. So in higher ed speak, we talk about the enrollment cliff a lot, and what that means. But there is just this trend going not like progressively down, but steadily down, that institutions are concerned about. So it clearly is an indicator that this job market is going to be tighter in the future. And then I also just pulled a couple articles from the Chronicle of Higher Education. They have a copy of this always at the library next to the board games. It's a easy to read, great magazine just to be kind of up to date with what's going on in higher ed. These are just from the last year. So again, I'm not trying to be like scary or shock value. They go a little shock value on their headlines, in my opinion. But there's just a lot of chatter about the workforce in higher education right now. So there is no secret sauce to be competitive, and yet it is going to be some combo of publications, teaching experience. I don't have networking or research on there. I guess that would go with publishing, but research could be a little broader than just publications. Yeah, networking and getting out there, getting your name, in places, and then university service would be some sort of, I guess, combo of that's going to be unique to each person. I guess I would note it's not necessarily just university service. Sometimes people are doing service within their professional associations, within local, local government, state, county governments, extension. So that can be a little broader just depending on where your industry is making an impact. And then the other part of the secret sauce is luck and persistence. Leading up to this, I listened to a couple of podcasts on the academic job search, and the overwhelming theme is really just there's a degree of luck where you don't know why your application was or was not selected, and then persistence, so applying to things you might not be as excited about just out of curiosity, and sometimes it takes multiple years of this cycle. So getting started, I just wanted to kind of talk through, especially from our vantage point as career services, kind of getting yourself in order to prepare for this season of applying, and some tips for that process. So step one would be making sure you know the people in your corner, and particularly those that are going to provide a reference letter. And that could be either they have a letter already prepared for you, or more importantly, they might be actually providing a reference months down the road, on the phone or via email. So having those people lined up early is really important. It depends on what you're going into, but a common rule of thumb is that you will have 3 references if you are going into academia, or if you're going into like a national lab or a research setting. Typically a minimum of 2 of your references need to be faculty. So if you have 2 awesome supervisors from past work and 1 faculty, you might want to reconsider that and have at least 2 of those individuals speaking to you and your academic performance. But yeah, just giving them a heads up and letting them know what your expected timeline is, sending them a copy of your CV. Of course, part of this process would be them giving you feedback on that as well. But I've experienced this myself and heard from many faculty is that this is often the last step people take, and it can be a little like last minute. You're kind of putting the faculty in an odd position if maybe they weren't prepared to give a reference. So step 1, have these people lined up. The second step would just be like thinking through what you're looking for. For some people, geography is a big deal. I don't, Michael, that's a big thing for you. Living near mountains or places you can run around.
The important things.
Yeah. Other people, they're trying to get more into urban areas. A common, thing to consider would be if you're targeting more research focused institutions. Some people, the top tier is going to be only applying to R1 institutions, or looking at institutions that are maybe more teaching focused or to the level of community colleges. And then just general cultural fit as we're all aware higher ed is not the same everywhere. There's just, especially East Coast, West Coast, there are very different feels in how higher ed is structured, just how you dress at work, like all of these different things. So kind of thinking through whether it's creating, your A, B, C levels of priorities. So not that you don't want to just not apply because you don't think it will be a good fit. I think there's something to curiosity and just seeing what could happen. But
I mean, that's a good point. I just want to point out too, like that's like the cultural fit thing, like, and my partner has talked about that, how like they do not want to work at an R1 institution.
Mhm.
Like that is like culturally, they do not want to be a part of that. But they're like teaching colleges too. Like they're 4-year just there's many in Idaho and in Washington, right? They are primarily teaching colleges, and
Yeah.
the culture is going to be much different than at like Washington State University, that's an R1 institution, or even Idaho now, right? I guess we're probably going to become R1. That's what they
we're on the
say.
cusp.
That's
Yeah.
what they say, is that we've met the metrics. So
Yep.
we'll see, But
So
anyway, yeah.
And similarly, yeah, like I've had colleagues go from working at like Gonzaga versus working at a public institution, and just a very different feel. Not good or bad. So just some job search resources. Higher ed is kind of nice where, unlike other job searches, it's not like there's endless places to look. Typically, if faculty lines specifically or staff are being open, there really is a smaller number of job boards that those are going to land in addition to the actual institutions page. And if you don't already, I'm sure you already have, in your Google Chrome, a folder or tab with all these bookmarks. Higher ed jobs is by far the most common. I think it's the cheapest for people to post on, but I would say it is not fully comprehensive, but it is the most comprehensive. And then sometimes more on the staff side, people really gravitate towards the Higher Education Recruitment Consortium. They actually will host a conference every year that's more like a networking based event. And then industry specific job boards would be, of course, more focused in whatever your discipline is, and professional associations. You do see higher education, like professor positions there, but not quite as frequently as you might see like industry-based jobs. But happy to chat with anyone individually if they're not sure where to start with their own job search. So just some tips for preparing your application. Did we already do a CV presentation?
We haven't done one yet, but we do have one, yeah.
Yeah, so I want to spare you from this being a whole presentation on your CV, but just a couple like light thoughts as you're getting it ready. The most common thing that you will do when tailoring your CV, because unlike a resume, you actually don't need to tailor your CV quite as much. It is meant to be, very comprehensive. But the number one thing you might do is, depending on if you're applying to a teaching university or a research university, you might flip those sections on your CV. Your education always will be first, but that second section really does tell me what your goal is, what you want to spend your time doing. So doing that flip of, I'm a teacher, here's what I've been doing, or I'm a researcher, here's what I've been doing, is important. Another important note is, if you're not already doing this, really highlight dollars that you have brought in. And that could be grants, of course, but also scholarships. Like, essentially, we want as many dollar signs associated with your name as possible. You are trying to position yourself as someone that money comes with, whether currently or in the future. And then, I don't have this on here, but similarly, if you have been a part of grant proposals, even like assisting, that really should be on your CV. That is something that really helps distinguish candidates, is, again, this idea that if we're trying to bring in funding in an increasingly competitive market, we're going to hire the people that we think are best positioned to do that. And I'm going to kick it over to Michael because he's the grant person.
Yeah, I mean, I was just gonna say about that, actually. That's I know my own position. Any chance I have to not draw from central university funds and fund through an external source, I take that opportunity, because my boss likes that better, right? If we're not drawing from the central funds and we're not pulling the budget, drawing from the budget. But also, like, every single time I do that, that's a CV line with a dollar amount that and I do my CV. I have what I did with the grant, like whether I'm the author or co-author, and then the dollar amount associated with it. And it's kind of nice because, I'm mentally like adding it up. It's like a list I can add up and be like, I have brought in this much money to the university. And those things are like what you're describing right now, contextualizing it within like this enrollment cliff, like that's money. I mean, that's just money that's going to be drastically, it's drawn out of the university ecosystem, right? Yeah. And so if you can offset that by bringing money in any kind of way, whether that's through or like I'm organizing a conference right now, and like our biggest goal is like how do we make this profitable in a way that offsets any startup funds that we use to bring in, right? So it's like, conference organizing, grant writing, anything that can generate revenue or bring in grant money is like going to look really good.
Yeah.
And actually probably will be a thing that sets you apart, because a lot of people get really good at like the subject matter, the publishing part. Once you get like the formula for publishing down, like it becomes not easy, but like, people can just publish. But like the people that I see who are like truly successful are people who like understand that financial component, right? And sort of leverage that really smart. So yeah, that's something like, and like in grant writing, we talk about that a lot. And yeah, it also gives you more freedom. Like, why wouldn't you want to do that? You have more freedom if you're not drawing from central university funds. You have more freedom over what you get to do in your projects as well, too. There's many reasons to do it. One of them, though, is it looks really good on a CV.
Yeah.
If you have a lot of money you brought in. So yeah.
So, but just that even if you have submitted and it's something that's under review, put it on your resume. Just people understand it's a learning curve to understand how the writing and submission process works. So getting that on the document is helpful. Make sure your CV has been reviewed by multiple people. Someone just commented to me today they're hiring, and there were some vandals that hired, and they were like, oh, why didn't they go to career services? Just little things like formatting things. And so I would just always say career services, we are not subject matter experts in any specific discipline. That said, we look at thousands of resumes every year, so we do have a good sense of best practices, how you can utilize space well, pitch yourself well. So I just personally recommend like a combo. Like you need your advisors or PIs or whoever is involved within your discipline. Have your friends read it, like go to Hungadunga, have a CV party. But multiple sets of eyes is really helpful. While I know it's sometimes painful to have sometimes a few different perspectives that might be imposing.
Yeah, so yeah, going up that, I mean, that's how when I do like graduate research fellowship review with people, I have this conversation where I always like, I'm not a subject matter expert in what the proposal itself is about, but like, it's like a CV. When you've read enough of them, like, what a good one is.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I know what one needs to sound and look like, and that's kind of what I'm always like, yeah, you need to work with your advisor on these parts, but like the sort of essence and the tone and like the voice of it, like, the ones that are successful, like you start to see like which ones actually get picked up and go on to be successful. So yeah.
One that's not on here, just have page numbers. A lot of people forget page numbers, but it's just a visual cue to keep going, especially on a screen. And then if you have a long CV, it's also in the interview process, or I guess review process. Sometimes they'll reference like view page 3 or 4. And then I'm sure many of you, if you've started applying, have run into the painful experience of uploading your CV, uploading your letter or other documents, and then you click next, and then it says, please enter your work history. And you're like, oh my God. So I would say it's helpful, never skip that section. Sometimes employers will actually screen based on the fill form version. So having a fill form version of your resume where instead of bullet points, you have a paragraph of text that you can copy paste into those boxes. For each of those experiences, have the employer's address and phone number. It will just speed up the process immensely, because I know that is by far one of the more tedious aspects of job hunting. Okay, next, always writing a cover letter. Definitely higher education is one where it will get read. I know sometimes people say they don't get read in tech or other industries, which is not true. Recruiters don't read them, hiring managers do. Recruiters are just trying to pass it along. But just making sure it's tailored towards each position. The thing that we notice most when we review cover letters is sometimes they're very passive, and they're just loosely reciting what you've done in your resume and not focused on specific accomplishments or specifically what you contributed to a project. And then the other thing is just conveying authenticity. The last podcast I listened to, which who knows where their data was from, but they said 45% of people use ChatGPT to write their cover letters. Recruiters are kind of telling us the same thing, that it's like, it's about half seem like too well written. So just making sure, even if you're using that as a tool to generate or to edit, that there's a lot of authenticity dribbled in there as well. And that could be a lot of things. That could be shouting out like the location of the school that you'd love to, hike in the wilderness or enjoy better restaurants than you've had in the last few years. That could be just using the word excited, just showing like what you're proud of, what excites you about your subject, working with students, rather than writing overly professionally. Okay, not always, but you may have a teaching statement depending on the type of position. I think we have a whole other session on these types of documents, but mainly you just need to make sure it is not just a philosophical treatise of teaching, but it does need to include actual stories and examples where the reader can picture you teaching, like create a setting where you're in a classroom or a lecture hall, something where the reader actually believes that you would do this thing versus philosophically, this is what I've read a good professor does. Typically we'll have a research statement. This is one definitely to work with your faculty on. There's a few different structures people will go about, but the most common that I see works really well is just kind of this narrative of, where your research has been so far, the kinds of things that you've been doing, what direction you're headed, but most importantly is like, what is the thread that really drives you? Because that's what's compelling, is that motivation that you have that's kind of carried you through these different aspects. And it can be multiple, but research statements get a little chaotic when it's just this list of like, I did this and then this and then this, and then I want to do these things. So creating some sort of thread that weaves everything together is really helpful. A diversity statement, candidly, these may become less common, particularly at public institutions in certain states or all states. Regardless if you have to write one or not, having some thoughts gathered on diversity, equity, and inclusion would be really important, just because you will have interview questions about that. Higher education is almost always going to be a diverse setting that you'll be teaching or researching in. So at a minimum, and then we have a session where we talk more specifically about if you're writing this specific document. Similarly, it's going to be not just writing philosophy, but writing kind of about your lived experience so far.
Okay. Well, one thing on that is that, so I just sat in on a session, a hiring session for a faculty position here on campus. And even though like it can't be written out, like, when the session opened up to questions, people were asking questions that sort of had these concepts baked into them, right?
Right.
And so it's like, it still came up, it just wasn't sort of part of the HR, questions that go into the interview itself, but like in the Q&A afterwards, it still came up, right? So it's like, it hasn't gone away, it's just sort of shifted to another part of the interview process.
So, but I'd imagine some schools are still.
Yeah, especially like you said,
have.
yeah, I mean, like, it's like, depends on the state too.
Yeah.
It's gonna depend on the state, it's gonna depend on like what kind of institution it is, like, but yeah, you're right, like certain public institutions in certain states, like it probably will go away.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So what I honestly see a little bit more common is the teaching statement and research statement will be like a big document, and often a diversity statement is built into like a set of short answers that you might have a prompt like as part of the application, rather than like a PDF that you might upload. So that's what I've seen both. Okay. You would want to be prepared to have a way to submit your dissertation or a chapter. Sometimes they will ask for basically a writing sample, specifically like a chapter. So just having that ready to go in your PDF form or however you want to send it would be great. For especially teaching heavy positions, having a sample syllabi. So kind of in the timeline, if you're preparing for your job search, having something prepared so you're not scrambling and building one last minute would be great. And often people, the mode would be develop your dream class would be one of the ones you'd want to have, and then develop a class that you would be very likely to teach, something, 300, 400 level, something that's like, yeah, likely that you could use if they were asking for not the aspirational class that you'd like to create. Okay, and then just as part of your application, statistically, people look at your social media or will look you up, even if they're not supposed to. Human nature takes over. So just knowing where you're going to be found, and do you want to leverage that? So LinkedIn would obviously be a great space to leverage. Ever since Microsoft bought LinkedIn like 10 years ago, it is truly very representative of all industries. It's not just business, it's not just engineering or corporate America. It is for scientists, it is for foresters, it is pervasively like there's influencers kind of across the spectrum. Yeah, double checking your Google Scholar to make sure initials right and all that kind of stuff. If you have a personal website, again, that is one that is very easy to get out of date. Like, I almost like recommend people don't have one if they're not really excited and want to make sure they keep it up to date, because half the time I click on someone's from their CV, it's a couple years out or pictures are old. So that's a personal choice. And then again, just any other social media that you may be found on. Okay. Last thing is just like a typical timeline, which I put typical in quotes. Most industries have some kind of a hiring season, and higher ed is definitely one of those. So this doesn't mean this is the exclusive time period. It's just like the top of the bell curve / there's actually a couple humps of this, of when postings are seen. But because the peak application period is October and November, that's kind of what this typical timeline is based on. So again, that's not the only time positions are posted, it's just the peak that we see. So typically we would recommend in August and September that application materials are getting reviewed by everyone you've got documents ready to go, and maybe starting to look in case there's any really eager faculty positions that are trying to hire really early. Again, October, November. The rule of thumb generally is, especially with these really tailored applications where you're calling out to that specific university's culture and student body, is it should take a couple hours for each application just to make sure you're really putting your best effort into them. November and December is the waiting period. To be candid, often I've seen a lot of committees don't even like reconvene until after the holidays, which I know is annoying if you submit your application November 15th and like they're not even looking at it until early to mid-January. So January, February is typically when people start hearing callbacks for first and second round interviews. So I mentioned this earlier, but there's kind of another little peak specifically for visiting faculty roles, and those are typically going to be in like the April, May zone, and that's a little bit based on when people know if they're going to be going on sabbatical. That pool of people is announced, so then you know which positions are going to open up for visiting faculty opportunities. So again, people's lives change, faculty quit at all different times of the year. So you often see stuff posted at any month of the year, but this would be kind of the typical timeline you see. And then just a couple things specific for interviewing. Almost all that I've seen recently for like full-time positions typically will bring you to campus after a initial Zoom interview. So one of those I guess tips is just mentally preparing to meet a lot of people. Higher ed is from any other industry, it is a very collaborative hiring process where typically you are meeting a dozen or more people throughout your time. Often a Zoom meeting is not one person, it's 6. And then you'll have a scheduled day. So with that, just from someone I met with recently, their first interview of the morning of a full day interview, the first one did not go well. Like, didn't really click with the department chair, and they had to like really be in their head all day to like remind themselves like that is one person. They really enjoyed the rest of the day, the rest of the faculty. So just kind of self-talk, just like U of I, I'm sure there's a couple faculty or chairs that you don't click with as well. That may be the person you first interact with at this university. It's one in a dozen. So, but yeah, it's a stamina thing too, where you just need to like mentally prepare. Career services, we can definitely coach on some tips for like, yeah, working through that type of interview. Just researching the institution. Every department is going to look different. They'll have a different makeup of majors, programs going on, reporting structures. For example, here at Idaho, our architecture department is in the College of Art and Architecture. And at WSU, their architecture program is in the College of Engineering. So just very different cultures. Like that would probably be a very different type of interview with different types of people involved. So the more you can research that, the better. Knowing the student makeup, if someone was interviewing here at Idaho and they mentioned, that we have about half or maybe a little more than half first generation students, that would be super impressive if they're coming in with that knowledge and how they would leverage that. And then as much as you can stock faculty collaborations, because not all, but most higher ed, whether they're private or public, there's a lot of public knowledge about who works there. It is totally fine to stock heavily. If you're name dropping, if you're mentioning someone's past institutions, very normal. I know in most other settings of life that would feel weird to have looked someone up on LinkedIn and start mentioning where they went to school or where they used to work. But in these interviews, it's just showing that you're like really dedicated to this process.
It's also like, when, how do you say it? You apply for graduate school and you should read papers by the people that
Right.
you want to work with. You know what I mean? Like that's like that's the first thing that's going to show them that you actually are interested in working there. Like you've gone in and like looked at who works in the department.
Yep.
And read scholarship by them and are familiar with that.
Yep.
Like,
Which is what makes this, a very tedious process because it's hours of your week where you're researching people on each institutions. I know there's like the tediousness too, where like every department's website is like set up differently. So then you have to figure out like, well, do you have bio pages or do you post, stuff here? So it's a battle. If it feels tedious, it means you're doing it correctly. So you may, if it's a teaching-based position, would want to prepare a teaching demo. I probably wouldn't prepare a whole demo until they actually ask you to do it. But being kind of prepared that you would have to give like a sample lecture. If you've ever been a part of one, you know that they typically will invite students in, and students, whether it's real or not, they get a say in like whether they want to hire this faculty member. And then just making sure you're doing storytelling. This is back to like basic interview skills, but telling like actual stories of how you've demonstrated your competencies and skills is always going to be much more memorable than just sharing like factual information. So, and then especially given that many of these are on campus in-person events, just always having really good questions ready so that it feels very conversational. And I would say as a note, it is fine to have those pre-written down. Like no one would ever think, oh, this person's cheating because they wrote their questions in advance. It actually just comes across that you're prepared and like have pre-thought what questions you might want to ask. So, and then always just asking about service opportunities, hopefully genuinely, but finding out kind of where do faculty plug into the department, just kind of, again, helps position yourself as someone who's wanting to be a part of the community within that college that you're looking at. So, I have a sample photo there. So, all that said, this is a arduous process. I know it does take sometimes people multiple rounds / years to go through this. And so sometimes the conversation is, if a faculty role doesn't pan out, then looking at fellowships or postdocs and basically just trying to be strategic with a gap year of what is going to make me most competitive for that following year. So with that, I'll answer any questions if you have access to those. Excited.
Yeah, Zoom folks, just feel free to unmute and ask if you have them.
There's one thing I would add that I didn't have a slide on is networking is really important. So the important thing though is like that the activity of networking is much more important / really only possible before you apply for positions. After you have clicked apply, most universities would follow rules where they cannot interact with you at all. So you can't inquire more about the position after you've applied, because now they're giving one candidate, extra information. So they'll actually be very curt usually and be like, no, like we can't tell you anything. So making sure you're kind of playing the long game and like not weeks before, like months before you're reaching out to inquire about like, what does the department look like? What kind of priorities do you have? And then a few months later, then you apply and will then be a stronger candidate. But it is, yeah, definitely playing the long game on networking, which is why, yeah, we host events and do things to try to get you all connected, give conference dollars away, like get you out traveling.
There is a hand raised, Gayla.
Yeah. Yeah, I unmuted too. I'm Gayla. I kind of wanted to add that like so I know this is kind of, it seems like it's more geared towards people for teaching and research positions. But I think that also okay, so I have experience in ArcGIS, and I was told to like have sample maps or sample map stories because you highlighted storytelling. And so like storytelling related to like geology and geography are really good, but just to like create something like a sample, would that be something like a good idea instead of like the work I've already done? Like just create like like you said, like a sample syllabi.
Mhm.
But like just a sample. Okay, cool. All right. I just
If you
want to,
have time.
yeah, I do have one. I did do one. I did do a short one, but I don't think it's very, very good though. I just like threw it together.
Yeah.
Um,
I'll even see on like the staff side of academia for any position that's like a director of a writing center, a director of a math tutoring lab, or anything like that. Typically at the final rounds, a part of your interview is going to be, hey, give a presentation on a proposal you have and your vision for this center or an event you would run or something like that. So, so I wouldn't say you can like prepare all of that in advance, but kind of thinking through like how would I show off my skill sets through a work sample would be helpful.
And
right.
also with RTAS too, I just want to note that like obviously we have a lot of different folks who do GIS work here. One place that always like, I think that surprises people is we have a GIS expert in the library, Bruce Godfrey, and like I'm just thinking like a position like that. Like I'm sure having sort of a public facing portfolio, in particular because of like the what that job is, right? It's like teaching people how to use our GIS and doing workshops and things like that. I'm sure he had some sort of a portfolio put together.
Yeah, and I was thinking of creating because you said to have a to be online fill form version ready. So I was advised by I took ArcGIS at when I got my bachelor's, and so my ArcGIS teacher along with my mentor, they both said, Gailey, you need to put your resume in ArcGIS form and either map story form or just, something using ArcGIS, and just get real creative with it. And so I was like, I've been thinking about that since I graduated with my bachelor's. So I'm working on my master's now. So I'm just kind of really, I just want to thank you for doing this today, for taking the time out for us and hitting all those bases. And then feel like you're preparing us for the career fair.
That's, I mean, shamelessly a little the goal. So, well, I would say kudos to you all. I know time is precious. So it does, speak a lot to your own career development to like take 50 minutes, go off task, think about the future. That's half the battle is like sometimes people just don't like thinking about the future. So they're like, I'll wait. I'll just go get some coffee. So yeah, we have 146 employers registered for the career fair. Spring is always a bit smaller. We actually are much bigger than WSU, which candidly, it's because they can only use the concourse of the Beasley, so they're just space capped. But I love the plug that ours is bigger. We're also bigger than BSU's.
No big deal.
Which is great.
No big deal.
Yeah.
Just,
Yeah.
Like
So, and I can't remember again, this session obviously was very focused on like academia, roles within universities. I think next week or sometime in the coming weeks, we'll have a session that's more focused on the opposite, going into industry, which is a little very heavily on like how do you adjust your CV, how do you interview when you're trying to move back into an industry space.
It's sometime next month. I can't remember the exact day.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Whole different set of tips.
right on. Well, thank you.
Cool, thanks,
Yeah.
Al.
Everybody.